All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'll go ahead and give an introduction, and then we'll move on with the agenda. All right. And always hard to see. All right. Am I showing the presentation mode?
You are, Zach.
Okay, wonderful. I'm trying to
nice.
move.
Maybe if you can. No, this is mine. Okay, I passed. Okay.
Everything's fine?
Yep.
Okay. Again, welcome to this Birds of a Feather, focused on metadata for data indexing and data discovery in material science and engineering. This was brought to you by the organizers listed below, who come from 4 different institutions on 3 different continents. And we got together sort of at the last minute under sort of this banner of shared interests. And this, and that shared interest in our initial motivation is shown here. And these symbols on the left for Optimate and the Materials Registry represent an organizational home, wherein the Optimate specification, there exists this organizational home for the, I think, 18 providers now who have adopted the Optimate specification. And I've listed the URL for the machine actionable list of Optimate providers. Likewise, the Materials Resource Registry project has an organizational home for the providers who've adopted that specification. I've listed the 2 providers, the machine actionable endpoints of the 2 providers that I know of. And then there's this cloud of other things going on sort of in this space. And I've listed a few things that we know of. And the organizers of this group are specifically interested in semantic web, linked data, JSON, and JSON-LD. And there's been quite a bit of adoption in this space to some degree. The providers that I list here, like Materials Cloud, Materials Common, Materials Data Facility, the NIMS Materials Data Repository, have all adopted schema.org, but that's just one flavor out of many. And there's other things that could happen. And I've listed the site data project that Stuart is working on, which is looking at how do we do more precise machine actionable definitions for concepts in materials and in chemistry. And there's also numerous general and institutional repositories that have adopted things like semantic web or schema.org that house materials data alongside of other kinds of data. So we really see there's an opportunity here and a gap that there could be some form of institutional home for the materials, specifically materials data providers who are working on things like semantic web and linked data and JSON-LD to think about how are we using these technologies? Are we using them the same, and how can we extend them? So what is a BoF? Just in case you're not familiar, any member or members of RDA can propose a BoF session at the next plenary, where the goal is to assess interest in a topic. So the goal here today is to get an assessment of the level of interest in this topic. And the outcome is ultimately a decision whether this should be converted to an IG, a working group, or retire the idea. And that's something that we'll have to work on shortly after this BoF session. The objectives that we stated in our BoF proposal were to define and socialize some of these opportunities with linked data, semantic web, and related technologies, to start to survey the landscape to see who is working on this in the space of material science, and to discuss opportunities for further collaboration and consensus building, the type of stuff that happens at RDA. The meeting format for today, we've tried to get together some invited talks of groups both within and outside of materials working in this space, and we'd like each of the 3 invited speakers to give a 10-minute talk and then 5 minutes for questions. We have invited speakers from Bioschemas, the Materials Research Data Alliance group working on data dictionaries, and the Materials Resource Registry. And then we've put together a set of invited panel from other interest groups and working groups within the RDA. So I just wanted to give a quick example, just in case you're not familiar with the technology that we're talking about. And this is just a very, very high level example, just scratching the surface of what is this technology. So a simple example, I was going to pull from the NIST public data repository. So in the Materials Resource Registry project, one of the products that was created was a materials data vocabulary, and it was published at the NIST public data portal. And if you go and inspect this page, look at the underlying HTML, you will see structured data markup embedded within the page. And I've chosen to use the schema.org validation tool. So I pointed I gave the URL to this landing page to the schema.org validator, and it's discovered dataset markup for this entry. But if it has not only discovered schema.org dataset markup, it has also discovered markup for the NIST extended resource metadata specification as well as DCAT. And I picked this example to show both the existence of structured markup that helps enable discoverability and findability of materials data and metadata, but also that it isn't winner takes all. Providers can embed more than one flavor of markup depending on the use case or the purpose of the data or their repository. So what is the scope of this BoF, or what do we see as the scope of this BoF? And I've produced a rather complicated figure, and I'll talk through it slowly, but the take-home message of this figure is that we want to work, this BoF is interested in a very, very tiny sliver. And I'm showing that as the blue sliver that goes horizontally across the screen. So the way this figure is divided up is there's a number of broad groups, both within RDA and outside of RDA, who are largely concerned with all the entire scope of material science and engineering as it applies to materials data. So I've represented the materials IG, which has this broad scope as well as others. And then I've created a matrix, and along the columns of this matrix, I've pulled in elements of the Materials Resource Registry vocabulary, and along the rows, I've brought in my own terms for relevant information and communications technology that are sort of relevant to RDA. So there's been past efforts within the RDA on data type registries, and the material science community was heavily involved in that particular group. The topic of this BoF is metadata for data indexing and data discovery, which I've placed sort of sitting between data repositories and data discovery and indexing services. Along another horizontal, I've highlighted the past working group effort on the materials resource registry, and also along a specific vertical. During the last plenary, Eva Campo, who I believe is on the call, organized a BoF along a vertical focused on microstructures. And I think this sort of thinking about the problem in verticals and horizontals can be very helpful. Along a horizontal, we would think about what does metadata for data indexing and discovery mean, spanning all the different subdomains. And then for the microstructures BoF, if that gets converted into some sort of group, that effort will have to think about all of the technology along the vertical. What persistent identifier services do we need? What indexing services do we need? What metadata for discovery and repositories? And then at the lab level, what do we need for LIMS and data management? And the list can go on and on. And as I said at the start of the slide, the take-home message is that our BoF is purely squarely focused on that thin blue sliver of data and metadata for indexing and data discovery. And there's a lot of other white space where other groups or individuals can be doing work. And with that, I'll stop for questions. And thank you again for coming. think if there's no questions, I can hand it over to Asahiko, who will moderate our invited speakers.
Zach,
Oh,
Jane here.
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, like, it's great to see this group pulled together, because I have over the last few years sat in on the CoData CoData RDA materials group, and I did get to attend Ava's really excellent session, and it just, given all the work that is happening globally, I think it's important to bring this group together. So I'm really excited to see this this pulled together in a BoF. Just thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay, if there, thank you. And if there are aren't any more questions, I believe we can move on to the next part of the session. Ray, I see you sharing the screen, but I believe we first have invited Alistair Gray. So if you could, yeah, thank you. Okay, so for the first part of this session, we've invited some members.
My mistake. Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you. So we've invited some members from the closely related communities, and first up is representing Bioschemas community. And we have Dr. Alistair Gray from Heriot-Watt University, and essentially what they've done this, what we would like to do for the biosciences. And so please go ahead and tell us about what you've been doing. So please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Alistair Gray from, I head up the Bioschemas community, and Bioschemas is about improving the findability of the life sciences resources on the web, and we do this through an approach that exploits and extends schema.org. So I first want to give you a kind of overview of what we are trying to achieve. So on the left here, we've got a web page. This happens to be from Guide to Pharmacology, but it could be any web page. And this web page happens to have a mix of ligands, so those are sort of chemicals, and proteins. So these are things that are important to the life sciences. And we, as humans, we can read that page and make some sense of it. But to a machine, that content is unprocessable. So the idea of bioschemas is to embed some simple markup to help the machines understand what this page is about, what at a high level is contained in that page. So the fact that there's a protein and that there's a molecular entity, and that these have some basic properties like name or associated disease with them. So that's put into a standardized vocabulary shared as JSON-LD, which means that machines can come along, and I represent this now with sort of the Bioschemas logo, and this can be harvested and used by other services. So the major search engines use schema.org markup, and they scrape that from various sites to give us improved search engine experiences. But we can also use this markup within our own domain. So on the right here, I've got various services from the life sciences domain that can, and some of them do already, scrape and harvest Bioschemas markup to help feed into their services. So we've got fair sharing, we've got the intrinsically disordered protein registry here, and some other community dedicated services. But we can also do this for more general research as well. So it's not just about the life sciences, it's also about feeding into other research graphs. So in this case, we're actually working closely at the moment with OpenAir to feed Bioschemas markup into the OpenAir research graph. So let's take a step back and see what schema.org enables for us. Okay, so schema.org is embedded in many websites already. And this is what gives us this improved Google search experience. So you see I've highlighted a few things here on the left. So we've got this rating. So this comes from the ratings that are embedded in the schema.org markup within the IMDb website. And then the Wikipedia ones, we get the rich snippets telling us who the production company is, who are the producers. And this is all based around extracting this machine readable markup and then processing it. And Google have taken that also one step further, and they've got their own internal knowledge graph that they've used, that they've generated from all of this markup, plus some other sources as well. So you see this if you scroll down the page of the True Grit search, and you get some extra information. So this is very similar to what you get in Wikipedia here. So schema.org, it's structured data. It's a lightweight vocabulary of terms. So it's loose semantics. And currently there are 792 types in it. So these are the things that we can talk about. And you'll see here in blue that there are some that we've added in from bioschemas. So the taxon, the biochem entity, but probably of interest to this community is the molecular entity and the chemical substance. So these are types of things that we can talk about. And then for each type, there are associated properties. So these are the things that we can say about them. And there are over nearly 1,500 properties now in the schema.org vocabulary. So as I said, Google ingests this information and they use it to power their search. So one of the things that the life sciences community are interested in searching for are molecular interactions. So I typed molecular interactions into the Google search engine, and this is the result page I got. And what I didn't tell Google was, actually, I'm interested in data sets about molecular interactions. So this tells me what a molecular interaction is, but doesn't give me any data about that. So I refine my search. I type molecular interaction data into this. And this is a search I did in 2020, October 2020. And you see I get some scholarly articles relating to this. I get some training resources, but I don't actually get to any data sets. I did this search just preparing for this talk this month, and this has actually changed. So now if you type molecular interaction data into the standard search box, you actually do get some data sets coming back. So in this case, the molecular interaction database, which is what I was actually looking for. And this improved search has actually come about because of another service that Google are currently offering. So Google launched a few years ago now, the Google Dataset Search Portal. And this is powered by the markup that they've ingested from various websites. And it's all the ones that say that they contain a data set. And at the moment, they base this on the data set, the description, and maybe the author information is coming through now. It didn't used to. And so again, I've just updated this slide so that it's got the most up-to-date interface from Google Dataset Search. So in the Google Dataset Search, because it's a dedicated search portal for datasets, I can type in molecular interaction and I find MINT there as the first result, which is what I would hope. So this is based on the schema.org dataset type. If you look at the schema.org dataset type, you'll find it on the schema.org site, and you'll find that it's got over 120 properties. Now, I don't know about you, I don't fancy putting 120 properties into my web page. In fact, I'm really lazy. I probably only put about 5 or 6 into my website. Particularly if you look through the properties, you'll find things like, is family friendly? Now that's actually based on creative work and is thinking about films and are they family friendly, or books, are they family friendly? So not all properties available on a type make most sense for what you're trying to do. So Google have provided a dataset profile over the dataset type, which gives you the sort of minimum required properties, so the description and the name, and then some recommended properties, so the citations are pointing to the publication about the dataset, an identifier, some keywords, things that you would help search and then discriminate between results. Now, Google have done this for types that they think are going to be useful for them as a business. So they do it for events, they do it for jobs. They don't do it for every schema.org site type within the vocabulary. And this is where Bioschemas comes in. Okay, so Bioschemas, we set up a community be about 7-8 years ago. And we were aiming to improve the data discoverability and the interoperability in the life sciences. Now, we weren't trying to replace the existing vocabularies and ontologies within the life sciences. They serve specific purposes and give very detailed biological models. What we wanted to do was exploit schema.org and give minimal extensions to schema.org to allow it to be used for the findability and the interoperability of life sciences resources. So we do this through two main features. First, we extend schema.org with a small set of types to allow us to describe life science types. So gene, protein, taxon, so we can describe species, molecular entity, and chemical substance. We're also extending this with some more ones now, but this is as we get into more detail. And then the second thing that the Bioschemas community are doing is providing usage guidelines, profiles over these types, which really focus on what is the minimum set of properties that we need to search for something of that type. And when we get the results back, how am I going to discriminate between two seemingly identical search results to decide which one is the most important for me? And then the final thing that we're doing is providing support software to help us gather the data from the data sources and search over that and provide useful functionality over it. So I thought I would use this talk to kind of feature what we have achieved with Bioschemas and the markup extensions. So our first portal was the training portal of Elixir, which is the life sciences e-infrastructure in Europe. So TESS is the name of the portal, and this exploits Bioschemas to gather in information about training events and training materials, and then provides a dedicated search portal over this to allow you to search. In this case, I've searched for toxicology, and it links that to a keyword and then gives me the training event and the training materials associated with that. This is based on 3 types and profiles within Bioschemas. These are over generic schema.org types. So course and course instance exist in schema.org. Training material is our profile name over the creative work type. And this allows us to automatically ingest this data. So there's no need to understand the APIs of the source data sites. They just put this within their standard web page, and we use standard GET HTTP requests, just like your browser does, to gather that information. In this case, there's no concept merging because an event really only occurs on one website. We've also done this within the intrinsically disordered proteins community. So this is a specialist community who are interested in a small subset of proteins. They have a small subset of specific data sets. So this is a small subsection of those. So disprot, disordered proteins, MobiDB, and the protein ensemble. So we've embedded life sciences specific types and profiles within them. And then we use our tool called Bemuse, which is the Bioschemas markup extractor and scraper, to ingest that data using the protein sequence or sequence annotation and sequence range profiles to feed this into a specialist knowledge graph about intrinsically disordered proteins, which now provides a search registry called IDP Central. In this case, we still had no need for custom APIs. It's just using HTTP GET because the markup is embedded within the web page. But we had to do concept merging because each of these sites mention the same proteins. And so we needed to identify when we were talking about the same protein across these different sites. The third use case I wanted to highlight today is OpenAir. Now, as I said in the introduction, we've started working with OpenAir recently, and we're in the sort of prototype phase of seeing whether we can use Bioschemas to feed into the research graph of OpenAir. In this case, there's still no need for custom APIs, and this is why OpenAir are really interested in this approach, because we can then scale this out to multiple different subdomains. We don't need to know about each domain's specialist web services in order to gather the information. In this case, we need to do a terminology transformation. So we've used bioschemas, a slight extension of schema.org. OpenAir within their knowledge graph use the DataSite vocabulary. So there's a mapping step that goes on in this ingestion pipeline that maps from the bioschemas to the DataSite. And then once it's in DataSite, there's concept merging so that we can identify the same proteins coming from different places, but also we can link the publications. And then this allows this to fit into the OpenAir knowledge graph, which has information about the publications, the projects, the data sets, the people, the funders, and then feed into all of this together so that you can start really exploiting this information. So just as a summary, Bioschemas, it's an extension of schema.org. It's about providing a usage profile over schema.org. It's about embedding machine understandable, lightweight semantics within your web pages so that we can improve the searchability of the web to get us the information that we're interested in. This was our grand vision. So the markup goes into the web pages once and can be reused by the search engines, by dedicated search portals for our own domains, our own communities, but also across the communities into things like OpenAir. This really fits into the FAIR ecosystem. So I've mentioned findability a lot. So we use globally unique identifiers, community-defined enriched metadata, indexable by search engines, but it also fits into accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of the data. In particular, this extension to give linked control vocabularies and link to other resources. And of course, this isn't all my own work. This is a much larger community. So this is even not a complete list of the people who've been involved. But if you want to find out more, you're more than welcome to get involved with Bioschemas. You can join our monthly community calls. You can message us on Slack, or you can see what we've been doing on GitHub. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very fascinating. Any questions from the audience? If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or speak up or write in the chat.
I have a question if there's time. It's Jim Warren.
Go ahead.
So yeah, very nice. So how do I ask this very nicely? Who's using this?
Who's using this? Okay, so we're using this within dedicated sub-communities within Elixir Europe at the moment. So we have some use cases within the rare disease community, the intrinsically disordered proteins community, and also the plant community. And these spread out beyond just Europe. But we're now sort of moving on beyond this to OpenAir. So this is the EOSC open cloud infrastructure. So really this is potentially used by anyone. We have deployments on over 100 sites at the moment. We've started doing our own local harvesting of some sort of 700,000 pages and loading that into a triple store to build up our own data set about this. And we're starting to analyze what we've got in that information. So yeah, in some ways we're still at the early days, but yeah, no, it is something that has a lot of potential going forward, particularly with this OpenAir connection.
Thanks.
Thank you. I see a hand raised from David Elbert, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. That was brilliant. That's really cool. I guess sort of following on Jim, what tooling have you provided people so they can use this? And it's like, what's the most important part of that tooling? Are you targeting repository? I mean, where do you target?
So I guess so we've spent a lot of time helping people develop the markup and put the markup within the web pages. So we have a lot of training material based on that. The key bit for the communities to be able to exploit this is providing this Bemuse markup extractor. So this is a tool that we've developed at Heriot-Watt. It's not a scraper, it's a data harvester. So you give it a set of pages that you're interested in getting the data from. and it will go and extract the markup from them. At that point, you then need to think about what it is you're going to use the markup for. So the concept merging is typically dependent on the domain you're in and what identifiers you have available within the markup. So that's where there's sort of some custom work that goes on. And then obviously this can then feed into repositories, so it can be exposed through existing repositories, which is what we've done with the plant community with FADER, or you can build custom new repositories, which is what went on with TESS and IDP Central.
Thank you. I see one more question in the chat from Gerhard Goldbeck. If I can read it out. How do the schemas relate to the well-established ontologies in life science, for example, gene ontology and Chibi? Do you reuse definitions?
Yeah, so absolutely. We're not wanting to throw away what has gone before. So one of the things that we've been very keen to do is keep track of what terms are going to be useful, what existing terms there are in the community already. So you'll notice that we provided a molecular entity type and a chemical substance type. The definitions for these are actually taken from KEBI, and we link back to KEBI for those definitions and that distinction between them. And similarly, several of the properties that are on those types are KEBI properties or very closely related to KEBI properties. So we developed these within the Bioschemas community. We've now pushed those up as a sort of extension into schema.org, and they're currently sitting in the pending area, which means that they're not officially part of the core vocabulary at this point, but they are there for people to see and start to play with and explore. So they could still have some refinements done to them before they become part of the core vocabulary.
Thank you. All right, we'd like to move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Alistair.
You're most welcome.
And that was very, very informative. And next up is representing the RDA Materials Registry Working Group. We have Ray Planter from NIST. So can you pull up your slides, please? We see it. Please go ahead.
Okay, just a moment. Taking a little while for my schedule. So there we go. Okay. First of all, my apologies to Alistair for jumping the gun earlier there. But that was a great introduction and great lead into some of the things I'm going to talk about here. I'm not going to talk so much about metadata specifically, but more about how you kind of harvest that metadata together and provide it as an index for discovery. And so, as many of you know, through our RDA working group, we developed this materials resource registry, which is meant to be a gateway for discovering data for material science. And I want to talk about that model, what it's based on, so that we can compare it with other models, for instance. This is not meant to be a sales pitch for this particular model, but really just the context necessary for comparing it with various options that are offered to us today. And I'm going to start with a bit of a straw man that looks at two models for data discovery. One I'm going to call the registry-based model, and that is the model that the materials registry is meant to implement. So the idea is you have a searchable registry that serves as this entryway to discovery. That registry contains very high-level descriptions of descriptions of high-level resources. And by that, I mean things like repositories and databases, as opposed to not necessarily individual data sets, but those higher things that contain data sets or other relevant data. And you can search that, and once you find things in that registry, you can go visit those other resources and search there or explore there to discover the more specific resources or more specific data that's of interest. And at first blush, the idea is that providers can visit the registry to enter a description of the resource that they want to be made visible through that registry, for example, by typing in metadata. Now, we might contrast with that with another model that I just might call the Google model, and that's basically the model we just heard about earlier, where you have a searchable index that is built by harvesting metadata from embedded in these web pages. Okay, so it's up to the providers now to embed that metadata into a web page rather than entering it into a registry form, if you will. And once that metadata is embedded and an indexer can harvest that information and index it, they can provide searches that can discover those high-level resources, just like a registry, or more detailed things like individual data sets, if there are landing pages for those data sets, or even individual data points or pieces of data, depending on how much metadata is provided and harvested. So the materials resource registry, I'm going to focus more on this registry model and describe how it's meant to work. And the materials resource registry was designed and based on a discovery model developed in the astronomy community through a framework known as the Virtual Observatory. And this was an international federation of data services and providers. And this model was good because it enabled an incremental buildup of discovery infrastructure, which is good when you don't have a lot of infrastructure in place to start with. And in particular, it has this model has a low entry-level investment for providing for providers to become known to the community, and then there are incremental costs for increasing interoperability. That is, you put in a little more work and your stuff is more visible, more interoperable. And this model also emphasizes sort of non-centralized services and local control and curation of data. Okay, so how does this model work? So it has, there are registries, and there's no single registry, there are multiple registries, and then there are data providers that are providing all of these data sets and data services, okay? And it works something like this in broad. Okay, you have a full searchable registry that wants to know about everything there is in the world that has to do with, in this case, astronomy. And it goes to a registry of registries to find all the other registries in the Federation. And it found those, it pulls in all this metadata using a standard protocol about all the data sets and resources that are known out there. And now for a user to find an application that will first go to the registry and search for relevant high-level resources, repositories, and services, and in relevant services that it knows how to query, then it can then go off to those specific services, send queries to them, and actually bring back references to individual data sets that are tailored to their question. So the idea is that a registry is kind of the first tier in a tiered searching model, and what really helps this along is that a service description can claim compliance with some standard interface that applications may recognize, and when they do recognize them, they can use those services automatically. Now, astronomy put a lot of effort into defining a whole suite of standard services for discovering different kinds of data. Those kinds of services are just starting to emerge in material science. And a very nice example of that, of course, is Optimate, which we saw in that very first slide in our session. But there are also some commonly deployed software packages or otherwise important community software data centers that provide APIs that applications may recognize if they see a description that about them, and so it could be, and these APIs can participate in, again, this tiered kind of search model. And we saw in an earlier session on last week with the materials interest group, which Chandler Becker describes a little demonstration that she's been working on that exercises this model. So we're just starting to kind of build out this framework at the moment. So of course, getting metadata into a VO registry, it started off with people typing metadata into a form at the registry, but really where the growth happens is when metadata can be harvested more automatically, and big data providers could publish their metadata through a standard interface, and that's the OAI PMH interface. And so all they have to do is give their endpoint for this service into this registry of registries, and then it can be found by anybody who wants that metadata, and that metadata is harvested in and indexed. So another innovation that the VO did was a specialized sort of sitemap, if you will, for services, APIs that they offered, describing not only standard services, but also proprietary services. And again, this could be automatically harvested and put into the registry. Okay, so we might compare that to, of course, getting metadata into a Google index, as we heard, was very nicely described. Basically, a provider embeds harvestable metadata into the web pages, and then the provider publishes a sitemap file that points to all the different pages that have harvestable metadata. And so now the indexer can discover that sitemap and commence the harvesting and create the searchable index. The one thing that's a little mysterious in some Google type implementations, namely that done by Google, is how that sitemap gets discovered. So basically what you do is you put your sitemap out there and you just wait, and eventually the Google bot will find your sitemap and then harvest it. And that works pretty well. However, if someone else is developing an index, maybe a more specialized one for materials, we need a mechanism for doing that discovery. Now let's compare these models a little bit. So what I hope I showed very quickly is that this registry-based model that was developed in the astronomy community evolved to take on some Google-like features that allowed for more automated harvesting of metadata, and actually made the registry more of a background, less seen entity in this whole framework. So the OAI PMH endpoint was kind of like the sitemap, and also providers could provide this service description sitemap also that could be automatically harvested. So can we take, can we make a registry like the materials resource registry take advantage of this embedded metadata? And the answer, of course, to that is yes. And so a provider just could point a registry to the sitemap, and then the registry could harvest that schema.org metadata and index it into the registry. And of course, that will bypass this OAI PMH mechanism, or the custom API in general that Alistair highlighted. So I want to close with highlighting sort of two features of the registry model that I think are important to make sure that we implement or or make use of in some kind of future indexing framework for material science. And one is that in our registry model, there is this action that someone takes to connect to the larger, well, to a registry or to an index. And that is, a provider can say, I want to be part of this global index, and then can give an endpoint to that index builder so that the information can be harvested, okay? Or an index builder may say, I'm building a very curated index, and I want that data provider to be part of my index. And so they can go and look for a sitemap in some expected location and then harvest. So that is, be very explicit about how a provider connects to an index with a real action, and not rely on, say, a bot to discover your sitemap and decide whether to harvest. The other thing is to provide I think it's important to provide a way of describing services that may not necessarily have a web page associated with it, that can be harvested in a similar way, and so that those descriptions can be indexed as well, and that applications, when they discover those services through a registry-like service or index service, that they can automatically make use of those services to do deeper searches. And they can describe, the services can be standard services with standard interfaces like Optimade, or it could be proprietary services provided by important community portals. And I'll note that Optimade, of course, has a registry feature as part of the Optimade framework, and so that applications can discover all of the services that implement the Optimade interface. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Hi, Ray. Oh, should I jump in or?
Go ahead.
All right. So, I've heard a little bit about this before. I think it's really just exciting to see all this happen. How, do the material science folks or just other scientists at NIST, the cultural change kind of thing, how are you getting folks to kind of recognize the importance of your work? Is the uptake? I mean, because it's just amazing, lots of good infrastructure and work that you guys have accomplished.
Right. So we have built up the contents of the registry sort of through two mechanisms. One where we invite people to create logins to the registry and register there and describe their resources into that registry using the forms there. But also we have sort of curated records ourselves, gone out and found things and put those into the registry, and then invited the owners of those resources to take over maintenance of those records if they wish, or otherwise we'll continue to curate them. And so so there are a couple hundred records in there at the moment, but I think really where the further growth happens is in supporting some services that can help drill down into real data sets rather than to just repositories. So that's one of the places that we've been looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I know you guys use DSpace, and in Dryad, what we started to do was show how many times the data set was downloaded, and that got scientists, researchers excited, right? because they saw their stuff was downloaded. A download doesn't necessarily mean reuse, but we would call them our pet pet contributors, because you would see if somebody started noticing their data sets were getting downloaded, the scientists would go back and get other data sets and put them in there, like with older publications. Because they sort of got jazzed up, like, oh wow, somebody's looking at my data, I'm going to put more in there. So that just could, sort of the culture. Anyhow, thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
I
see
might
a
think
hand.
that. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, yes, we don't have a way for people to very easily see how traffic might go from the registry to their site, and to see that advantage. So that's also kind of a barrier to growth, but it's a lot easier to sort of see that with services. Go ahead.
I see a hand raised from Alistair, so please.
Hi, Ray. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. But my question was, you presented it a bit as a sort of either or, I think. So you either adopt sort of a community metadata model and have that harvested through, or you do schema.org markup. I was just wondering if you felt that these two could both coexist, and if they can't, then if you adopt your more sort of your own approach, will the search engine still pick up your metadata as well?
So actually, my point was that they could coexist, and in fact, there's many advantages for integrating the support for embedded schema.org metadata. That is, it's just another mechanism to avoid having people go, type in metadata into a form. So absolutely, they can coexist and should coexist. And certainly, what we do in the future of materials, doesn't necessarily have to look exactly what it looks like right now. I think really, what I'm trying to focus on are, what are the features of the framework that that will, make this, allow this to grow and be effective.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Round of virtual applause. And we'd like to move on to our next speaker, representative from MAR, the Data Dictionaries Working Group. Donnie Winston, so we've invited Donnie Winston and June Law. Are you going to do the talk, Donnie?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, please go ahead. We see your screen.
Great, thank you. So rather than show slides, I'm going to talk and go through a bunch of websites about our work. I've also, in the collaborative notes, I've typed in a bunch of links for some of the main things that I'll be going over, so you can have that. So I'm representing a working group out of MARTA, the Materials Research Data Alliance, which is an interesting experimental group. I think it's akin to the RDA, but I guess it was thought that perhaps the materials community could get together and have a discussion about these things independently. So I joined that for our first meeting, and we formed this working group called the Data Dictionaries Working Group. And we currently have a GitHub repository here, with a bunch of things, and in particular, the the documentation repo is where you can find exactly what we're about, and what we wanted to accomplish. And I won't, read through it, but essentially, our thesis is that we can use the concept of linked data in order to better share research data sets and help give people tools and methods and some pedagogic material in order to enhance their data sets to make them a bit more discoverable. So I'll go over kind of what I mean more by that. And we essentially have different subgroups working on existing published data sets and to try and amplify them with linked data and see how that goes in terms of making them a bit more discoverable and having people be able to publish data sets using this semantic approach. We also have a lot of our discussion on the matsci.org community forum. I've put that in the link as well. So we have a bunch of stuff here that people can look at. So for people who aren't familiar with the idea of linked data, it's this idea that hopefully, in order to facilitate a web of data, not just a web of documents, to try and use URIs as names for things, in particular use HTTP URIs so that people can look up those names. And when someone looks up a URI, to provide useful information using semantic web standards, and also include links to other URIs so that they can discover more things. And there are these kind of there's a star system. And I think a lot of people now have essentially gotten up to 3 stars. And we're trying to especially help people who have their data available on the web. In particular, it's in a machine readable format, and it's non-proprietary. So a lot of people are, as supplementary information to articles, are posting things to Dryad or Zenodo or Figshare. They're posting CSV files, JSON files. So they have this open data, but they're not necessarily using URLs as names for their terminology, so that we don't know if someone's using the same term when they say that they're, a JSON field that it's surface or SEM zoom setting. They're just all words. And so we want to help people use URIs and also to link to other people's data in terms, other terminologies like bioschemas or any other kind of terminologies. And so how do we do this? So one thing that we've been focusing on for JSON is this JSON LD format, which at least for JSON data sets can be a way of encoding linked data and URIs, but still as JSON. So I'll show you one example data set that we've gone through a subgroup. There's this article on density functional perturbation theory, phonons for inorganic materials. And you can see that this is reported in the Scientific Data Journal. And there are definitions of a lot of the terms that are used. So there are a few tables here that describe the JSON keys. But you can see that this is a table in a PDF. It's not machine actionable unless you mine the data. So you might have the idea of, okay, a material ID is a string, and that's a materials project ID number. You have to know that MP means materials project. This is a plane wave cutoff. You know that's a unit, that it's Hartrees. So there is some information in the paper about how to interpret the JSON data set. And in fact, the JSON data set is available, linked to from the article on Figshare. And so you can go here and you can download it. And if you were to download it, which I've done, I'll just show one little example. I have this folder of all these different JSON files, and if I were to show out one of them, you can see that there's this JSON file, and we can see things like, end sites.
Johnny, we're not seeing your JSON.
Oh, we're not seeing the JSON. Okay. All right. It looks like I'm just sharing my window and not my screen. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I want to share my desktop one. Okay. Here we go. This should be better. Can you see the JSON now? Okay, great. Thank you. So I've gone ahead and downloaded, the gzip Figshare, and I'm just looking at one of those JSON files right now. And so you can see this is a JSON file that includes, things like metadata, like a cutoff, a pseudo potential hash. So the JSON file has all these things, but we don't actually know. A machine doesn't know what point group is. We as material scientists know what this is, perhaps, but it's not a URI. But this can be if this were JSON LD. That is, if there were an app context thing in the JSON, but we don't currently have that in this data set. So essentially, what we're trying to look for in this working group is allow people to build up these, what we're terming data dictionaries, to be a lightweight, non-scary word for ontologies. But just something that allows annotations of all these things and allows people to point at things and mint these URIs to point at things so that metadata search can discover them. I think, how am I doing on time? I probably just have a few more minutes, right? Is this right? I haven't been paying attention. If someone can chime in.
We're running a little short on time, so okay.
A little short. Oh, okay. So I just want to emphasize that people can go to this working group, but what the kind of thing that it looks like is if you had something in the context, and here's another data set we're working with. June Lau is on the call. So there are a couple of data sets, and there's another one about thin films that we're trying to revamp, something that our session host, Zach Trout, has been working on as well. But the general idea is you might have this context where you can go, and here's, I've done a dummy example that we haven't published this, but for example, we might have a URI where in one of our data sets, the at context might be this part of the URI. And so when you have a key in your JSON document that says surface or something, you could actually get that in a browser. Maybe with content negotiation, you could get it as another format. And it would, this is very simple. It has a comment, but you get machine actionable information about what that means and how it might be related to other things and what vocabulary it's defined in and where you can go with that. So, this is all nothing too new, but the main thrust of the working group is to be able to come up with these dictionaries of terms and enable people to mint URIs and be able to deploy them and to emphasize practical ways that people can do this. And so the outcome of this group would be for each of the 3 subgroups to have their own method of creating these dictionaries. I know that Jamie at Rensselaer, she has a certain framework for doing this that we're using for the abstracts data set. I know that Stuart Chalk on the call has a mechanism for scientific JSON LD that we're doing this for, and Zach Trout also has a Cordra based method. So there are different ways of doing this sort of thing, of being able to mint and host these things online so that people can develop these vocabularies. And again, the goal of the group is to produce a practical document whereby scientists can know, given their 3-star data set, essentially, how can we mint terms and provide context so that when we next publish things to anywhere, to a repository or anywhere else, that stuff will be more likely to be 4-star, 5-star linked data. That's using resolvable HTTP URLs as names for things so that things can be inferred. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Applause for Donnie. I'm sorry, we don't have much time for questions. So we'd like to move right on to the panel session, if that's okay with you. But thank you to all the invited speakers, and I'd like to hand over to Rosella. So please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Sorry, we're running a bit late, but I think this is fantastic because there is a lot of questions, great discussions. That's great. So, and now we are starting a panel session. First of all, I want to thank the invited panel members, Alicia, Jim, Stuart, and Matthew. I will ask you 4 questions, and I will go in round robin fashion for asking you to answer. And please try to stay in 1 minute answer for that. So let's start. If I'm able to switch slide. Okay, so first question about the landscape. So what do you see as the gaps and the overlaps with regards to the topic of this BoF? So metadata for data indexing and data discovery. So I will ask Alicia to start answering, please.
So I see this, thanks very much for the intro. My perspective is very much through the lens of building a specific data repository in this area. And I would see that the gaps and overlaps are particularly related to understanding how to encode this kind of information or these kind of tools in developing a database from scratch. I think that's something that's very much needed in the community in order to provide basically best practices for anyone getting off the ground. I think that's really important. And then along with that, understanding really the use cases, basically what that will provide you with as someone who's developing or curating a data repository is what and even for non-technical people to understand and speak to the decision makers to understand what this will actually give you in the future. Is it future proofing? Is it something you can action now? That kind of translation from the actual physical tools to something that the average person can understand, who is the one that's maybe funding or developing this at a higher level. That's something that I think is really important. And I speak from experience, not being a technical expert, is, I've been gleaning the use cases and the importance through experience and through discussion, but having a clear roadmap for what's the power of this as from a materials data repository, I think is incredibly important. So I would say that is a conceptual gap that is that needs to be traversed.
Definitely. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So now, Jim, would you like to give your answer?
Well, I like what Lisa just said. I would just perhaps emphasize, the notion of utility is what we're after. And so the more that we can define even narrow use cases where we can show preferably a material scientist or engineer how this will actually make their life better for them, not in some abstract story, right, that we tend to do, but to actually, sit them down and show them how this is a research tool. That's what we're looking for, right?
Thank you. Stuart, your point of view from the chemistry.
Yeah, relative to gaps and overlaps, I think one of the things that brings to my mind immediately is how to nominally represent materials with some kind of unique identifier. And that's a complicated thing because the materials is a big space and there's lots of obviously complexity, not just the composition, but the phases and all that kind of stuff. But nominally, if there was some way to be able to, come up with some way to identify a material from intrinsic properties that you could apply a unique identifier to, that would be that's a big gap, I think. I also think that there's a need to get out into the material science community and actually interview a lot of bench material scientists to try and work out what is the contextual metadata that they think is important to describe their particular material and the experimental data that they gather from that material. Because again, materials is a very broad space. There's lots of different types of material scopes, and there may well be a lot of different metadata requirements that are different depending upon which type of material you're looking at. So there's another interesting and potentially very big gap, I think.
Thank you. Yes, that's true, definitely. And Matthew, about Optimade, what is
hi, thanks. So yeah, I'm coming at this from the sort of the Optimade side, where we're kind of working under the assumption that there's probably going to be an explosion of databases, or things that we currently call data sets will become sort of interactive databases. And we've certainly, we've started to see that with Optimade now with sort of nearly 20 providers, hopefully more in the future. And I'm going to be pretty boring and just agree with everything everyone's already said, right? I think that the tools for database providers are crucial, and I think everyone is already sort of getting on board with that. Within Optimade, we have tools to go from JSON to a full, full database API that is already going to be sort of the right formats. And I think, then it's easy to sort of build clients for sort of aggregating across those sort of standardized data sets. Well, easy, you know what I mean? And I think the registries are a good way of moving towards sort of extending that scope. I mean, one thing this is maybe bleeding into question 2 a bit about the challenges. A lot of the stuff we've spoken about is sort of publishing data or disseminating data with the community. I think a lot of this stuff is going to become more pervasive once the tools that we have, once the data sets people are creating are marked up as they are created. Right, so they can actually use the same tools to explore their own data, to make inferences or whatever. And I think as a community, that would be a fantastic sort of aim to have, is how can you streamline the actual data creation rather than just sort of curation process.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a priority. So you already answered the second question. Thank you. So now, Jim, would you like to go ahead on this second question about priorities in short and long term?
Wow, so many priorities. Now I have to pick one. So I don't know. Let's see. I would say that the most important thing to do is to define and find funded groups that are doing these things, even if it's small scale, because the challenge I found with the RDA meetings, as much as it's all a bunch of wonderful people who largely agree, they often have to go back home to their jobs, which don't really have very much time for these activities. And so the more we can find and bring together the limited amount of resources we have to work on these problems, and to do it more frequently than once every 6 months, the more progress I think we're going to make.
Yeah, it was already highlighted in your session. Definitely, yes. This is a key point. Stuart.
I think short term, we absolutely need to continue aggregating resources. As much as there's already a lot of efforts on this, as was spoken before. Again, materials is a huge space, and trying to identify really, the scope of those resources that are out there and that are potentially available is really important, not only just for aggregating them, but obviously for doing a gaps analysis, so you can identify what else is missing. Long term, I'm going to go down the logical path, I think, of ontologies, because semantic representation of data is obviously down the road going to be hugely important. And as we in chemistry are finding out, it's kind of like, who is the authority to define, let's say, an ontology or a high-level ontology for material science? Who is that? That's a good question. Maybe Jim can answer that. I don't know. But my point here is, if the materials community in a general sense, and whoever, let's say, is at the top of that, kind of helping to guide activities, if they don't take on this as a responsibility, somebody else will. And that may mean it's not implemented in the right way. And so there's potentially an issue. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be identified.
Yeah, sure. Alicia, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I would just say that I see a really important challenge in defining the challenges that these tools can actually expedite solutions towards. So, for instance, we work at Materium on the challenge of alternatives to petroleum plastics. So looking at a very specific set of materials, bioplastics, etc. And that for me, what I see is missing is understanding the potentially siloed approaches to different types of materials or different knowledge sets in chemistry and the biosciences, etc., that all may relate to that challenge. And so I think a more challenge, creating different lenses through which to bring together communities, I think would be really important in order to solve potentially grand challenges. So rather instead of thinking in traditional disciplines, thinking through the lens of challenges which bring together and need to work across disciplines in order to solve them. I think I see that as an acute challenge in the short term, but also it's going to be a long-term one for sure. And the kind of collaborative nature that's the collaborative communities that need to be brought together for that. I mean, one example of that is we're working at the intersection of designers as well as material scientists, and they talk very different language when it comes to data and the types of data that they work in. And to solve a grand challenge like plastics, you need to work across these communities, which all come together in a board meeting and decide on what a company invests in terms of their plastic portfolio. And so that's the type of interdisciplinary work that I think would be excellent to see when you drill down in terms of these the metadata and the data indexing, et cetera, is starting to talk across different disciplinary languages through the lens of challenges that we want to solve.
Yes, that's true. And Matthew, you rose your hand. Rose.
Yeah, sorry, I just because this is a comment on sort of question 2 that I didn't get in before is so I'm still relatively young. My exposure to this has been in the last couple of years as moving from a PhD to a postdoc. I wonder, what the panel thinks generally about how this is going to filter down to sort of undergraduate education or, education full stop. I think, programming has just about made it into a lot of scientific curricula now, but, going from like NumPy to saying, oh, now let's talk about ontologies is a jump. So yeah, I think this could be a good challenge for the RDA, is to help prepare sort of training resources in a way that's accessible to scientists. Similar to the stuff that I think Alistair mentioned about the Bioschemas training courses. It could be a good place to coordinate that. Maybe following the model of the sort of software carpentries and data carpentries.
Yes, that's a very good idea. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's go to the third one. So how do we balance the use of domain agnostic solutions with the creation of material specific solutions? So we'll start with Stuart now.
I think, again, and there's some commentary in the chat here about ontologies and certain smaller ontologies created out of smaller subgroups. I think it's a matter of, trying to understand how smaller domain specific solutions fit into the grand landscape of what is materials science, materials chemistry. And it really boils down again to the ontological definitions, or at least the right way to describe the information within a particular subdomain. I think that's the critical thing here.
Yeah. Matthew, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, a lot of this stuff will filter down once there's sort of mature generic software libraries that can do this or that are sort of modern enough to keep up with the current fashions in software as well, right? So it probably has to be Python at the moment, and you need the resources to develop that and keep it maintained. But until there's like a pandas that lets you semantically tag things without any extra effort, or just something that can easily validate against ontologies and schemas of all types, then yeah, I don't see how this stuff can sort of take off, and that can't be material specific, obviously.
Yeah. Alicia, do you have comments on that?
I don't really have much to add on that. I agree very much with what was been said, and just have the general caveat that anything that's super domain specific can lock out potential collaborations across disciplines. So it's just something to be aware of, but it's definitely something that is not obvious how you start and how you then build out. So it's yeah, but I agree with what's been said.
Yeah. Jim, do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I guess the only one is, while I've always been nervous about the materials community sort of going first on a lot of these technologies, because I mean, there are communities that have maybe an order of magnitude more funding, like bio, that we still believe that this is an incredibly important use case that can have a huge return on investment. So to me, if you say there are domain agnostic solutions, I'm like, materials, perfect place. We should be using your tools. Absolutely. But at the same time, a lot of the conversation is around, how do you get the adoption to the place that it needs to be? I don't think it's a hard sell. Going back to what Matthew was saying before in terms of adoption, if they can see the value proposition, right? If they really can see it, they'll adopt it. If you have to explain it, you'll probably lose it. That would be my final comment on that.
I see your point. Okay, thank you. And now let's move to the last one, since we have 5 minutes remaining. So there are different initiatives on materials, manufacturing, and science, but also application of same solutions to different disciplines. So this stays again in the same topic. What can be a good strategy to coordinate these efforts? Matthew, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I guess my sort of biased interpretation of that question is what we've done with Optimade, which is produce a fairly sort of rigorous machine readable specification and kind of just say to people, take it or leave it. If you implement this, you are now an Optimade provider. You will have all the benefits of other Optimade providers. You will be part of the network. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how it scales through to the future. But the kind of, you almost want sort of machine actionable coordination, right? I don't think a registry should be something you have to make an account for yourself and start uploading data sets to, even if it is for now. You want that to kind of sprawl as much as you can. Yeah, I don't know what the sort of the right answer is, because I don't think we're there yet, but at least in Optimade, we've had, as was mentioned in the last session, we've had sort of one provider come forward where no one had spoken to them, and they kind of just organically just started following our specification, which was good. But whether we'll get another one in the next few years is a different question.
Thank you. Alicia.
I would say the storytelling aspect is one of the most important things. It's already been touched on, but I think being able to adapt and apply solutions across different disciplines and coordinate efforts and disseminate, it's got to be through examples of what this did for XYZ application or XYZ organization or a host, or a set of organizations together, a consortium, etc. These kind of storytelling devices, even if it's on a very small scale, and you can imagine that, okay, imagine this, but then at the level of scale of the material science community, or at the level of scale or of what have you, that I still think that is got to be exploited in this area if we're really going to bring partners to the table for coordinated efforts.
Yeah. Jim, would you like to add something?
No, I really like that point. I would just amplify it further. I would say that building demonstration projects is critical here. And Optimade is a really neat example because there are all of these databases in that space. So it was as close to quote unquote obvious as any of these things can be. And it's great that they did something there, right? But at the same time, if we're going to wait for a huge number of other databases and similar domain specific things, we may be waiting too long. So, building out the cases, I think, is key, even if, as you say, they're small. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And Stuart, you will close this panel.
Yes, I think the only thing to add is, if we're talking about aggregating material science resources into some, nominally comprehensive website that people can access, maybe it is about reaching out to examples where things have been done in other disciplines, and maybe even integrating those resources into the material science nexus, maybe we can call it, so, but also labeling it as example use case in other discipline, so that it's specifically, hey, here's something to think about that maybe we haven't either thought about in materials, or we haven't had a chance to implement, and here's a solution to that particular thing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, all of you. It was a great sharing moment. Thank you for the discussion. It was great. And now, unfortunately, we are so late in time, or we can say we are perfect. So if you want to answer to a couple of questions, this is for the entire audience, you can find in the chat, sorry, not in the chat, in the shared document, 2 questions for the audience that you can answer even offline, no problems. So after this panel discussion, what are the topics you think are important and should be covered by this BoF? And what do you think is the home for this group? So as a working group inside RDA, as an interest group inside RDA, or under the umbrella of these existing external groups like Optimate, Bioschema, or MARDA, or as a new completely external group. We are very curious to collect your answers on that. And now I give the stage to Zachary to the closing remarks.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the RDA for hosting us. Thank you to the co-chairs who helped organize this. Thank you to all the invited speakers and the audience. And if you feel comfortable, please unmute and turn on your camera and give a collective round of applause to everyone. Thank you.
Go June.
And bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Cheers.